missile will come in, or the bombs, at 20 times the speed of sound. You won't even hear them. They'll explode here with 6 times the heat inside the center of the sun. And this is ground zero. It will dig a hole 3/4 of a mile wide and 800 feet deep, turning us, the buildings, and the earth below to radioactive fallout shut up in the mushroom cloud. 5 miles in all directions, everyone's vaporized. 20 miles from here in all directions, everyone will be lethally burnt, lying in what remains of the buildings and what remains of the streets. People will be sucked out of buildings by winds of 500 miles an hour, turning into missiles traveling at 100 miles an hour. Windows popcorn, shards of glass decapitating people. And then the whole area will be engulfed in a huge firestorm of 3,000 square miles. Even in winter in Boston, everything will burn. And as these fires burn, huge amounts of black radioactive smoke are shot up into the stratosphere all over the country, and the fires will coalesce right across America, east to west, north to south, and the whole country will burn. And as these cities burn all over the world, there'll be millions of corpses. But you can imagine what devastation it would be. We are close to that. We are like lemmings walking blindly towards the cliff of nuclear annihilation, worrying about things that don't matter.
This is Dateline News and Conversation. The topic for today's show, why men kill and why women let them. My guest is, I have to call her a friend, but she was the featured guest in my film, 30 Seconds to Midnight, which I produced in 2016. It came out in 2017. She is a medical doctor. She was on the faculty of Harvard. She is very well known, I should say was very well known in the United States for several decades as somebody who is speaking out against the nightmare scenario of a nuclear Armageddon. She studied the effects of radiation on the human body, and she's spoken out about this for most of her life, and she continues to do so. And my guest tonight, Dr. Helen Caldicott. Helen, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Regis.
So, Helen, before we begin, just give me a little bit of background on you, where you're from, where you were educated and received your medical degree, and how you ended up at Harvard.
Okay, so I went to medical school at the Adelaide University in South Australia. How did I end up at Harvard? Well, I had 3 babies under 3. While I was having my 3rd baby, my husband went to Harvard to train in pediatric radiology. I stayed at home, had the 3rd baby, and with my dying mother, and I brought my mother and my 3 babies to Boston to live there. And I was there for a long time, and I said to Bill, look, I'm bored. Do you think you could get me a part-time job at Harvard? So he met this man called Dr. Harry Schwachman, who is one of the pioneers in the treatment of cystic fibrosis. So I got a part-time job there, and I learned how to treat cystic fibrosis. And then we went home to Adelaide, and I found out that the children with CF in Adelaide were not being treated. The attitude was, they've got a fatal disease. The sooner they die, the better. And I said, look, I know how to treat this disease. And they said, who do you think you are? You're not even a pediatrician. You don't even have a higher degree. So I said to my husband, you will look after the children now, which I've done. And I'm going to go back and train as a pediatrician. I worked 80 hours a week as a pediatric intern. Then I worked as a registrar and then I sat for the exam for the Royal Australasian College of Physicians, which I then passed. And then I said to my colleagues, where is the cystic fibrosis clinic? And they said, we don't believe in special clinics for special doctors. And so a colleague and I got out the actuarial data and found that the patients in Adelaide died at the age of 4, whereas in all the combined clinics in America, they died at the age of 17. So they gave me the clinic, and I had 5 months to set it up before we left again for a sabbatical at Harvard, where I was offered a job and Bill was to work there. So I did. I set up the respiratory physicians, Miss Tense, the nutritionists, the antibiotics, everything that was necessary. And now that was the first cystic fibrosis clinic in Australia, and it now has the best longevity results for CF in Australia. But incidentally, they've now found a cure to that dreadful inherited disease, cystic fibrosis. So that's absolutely marvelous. But that's what I did. And then I went to Harvard and was on the faculty at Harvard Medical School, working in the nutrition and cystic fibrosis clinic. But while I was training to be a pediatrician, working 80 hours a week, I found out that we had a lot of radioactivity in the water in Adelaide, which is where I lived. And that was coming from the French tests. And they were testing in the Pacific Ocean on islands, Tahiti, and we were getting a lot of fallout. And so I wrote a letter to the paper, said, look, children could get leukemia from the cesium in the water, which is concentrating in the cow's milk. They didn't publish my letter, so I rang the editor and I said, where's the letter? He said, well, we get hundreds of letters a day. And I said, excuse me, but I said, mine's important. So he published it. And that night I was on television talking about radiation in food, children getting leukemia and cancer. And every time the French blew up another bomb, there I was on television. So I led that movement against the French tests while working 80 hours a week. And the people in Australia didn't like the French. They think they're arrogant. So there were huge marches in the city streets. People stopped buying French perfume, French wine, French cheese. And eventually the government was forced. Well, then I was invited to go to Paris with the then upcoming Deputy Prime Minister to see the French government. So we went to Paris with then Jim Cairns, and we saw the French, and we said, why are you testing them? And they said, well, our bombs are perfectly safe. So Jim Cairns said to them, well, why don't you test them in the Mediterranean? And their faces turned bright white and said, oh, mon Dieu, there are too many people living around the Mediterranean. So for the first time in my life as a young doctor, I was sitting opposite wicked politicians who didn't really care if children died of leukemia or cancer. And that was a very potent time in my life. Anyway, the pressure was so great in Australia that the Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, was forced to take France to the International Court of Justice, and they were forced to test underground. It wasn't the best, out of sight is out of mind, but they still were forced to test underground. And there was a phone call in my room. I'd been working probably all night, and the phone rang me at about 5 in the morning. It was from the Australian Broadcasting Commission saying the Court of Justice has ruled that the French must test underground. What do you think? And so that was a great thing. And I learned what President Jefferson said: an informed democracy will behave in a responsible fashion. So I was teaching the people of Australia as a doctor what radioactive fallout means. And so that was my initiation into all things nuclear.
Wow, Helen, that's fascinating.
And then I found out that this blasted Prime Minister wanted to mine uranium. I knew nothing about nuclear power or uranium, so I went to the the Barsmith University Library, and I got out a book called Poisoned Power by Goffman and Tamplin. Goffman, an MD who worked for the Atomic Energy Commission and who helped to discover plutonium, which is the fuel for nuclear weapons. And he was asked, and Tamplin, to investigate the dangers of nuclear power. And when I read that book, I just was flabbergasted. So that started me off on a round of against nuclear power. So I visited, our country is very well unionized. And so I traveled all over the country talking to union workers before they went out to work at 6 o'clock in the morning with a dirty old blackboard and dirt floors, drawing genes on the blackboard, testicles, radiation, mutations. And I got round to teach the whole union movement about the medical effects of mining uranium, such that in the end, the Australian Council of Trade Unions, which is the parent body of all the unions in Australia, voted to ban uranium mining. So once again, I educated the union movement about the dangers of mining uranium and of nuclear power.
Well, we'll continue on this topic of educating people. You spent many years in the United States educating people from coast to coast. You were quoted in newspapers. You were interviewed on television many times. And then you worked with me to make my film 30 Seconds to Midnight, which, by the way, is still going strong around the world. It's still relevant. Tell me a little bit about now the years that you spent trying to educate and open the eyes of American people about the dangers, not just of nuclear power, radiation, but the threat of nuclear annihilation.
Well, I founded an organization called Physicians for Social Responsibility, and we recruited 32,000 physicians to that movement, and I educated them about the dangers of nuclear war. And as well as that, I traveled all around the country, visiting sometimes 2 cities a day, talking to audiences of thousands of people. I also had an agent in Hollywood who worked for me for free, who worked for Tom Cruise and Lily Tomlin, Sally Field, and who got me on television all over the country. So once again, I was able to educate the American people about the dangers of a nuclear holocaust. And then I met with President Reagan in the White House. His, daughter had heard me talk in the Playboy Mansion about nuclear war. And Patty Davis, got me to meet with her father. She said, "I think you're the only person on earth who can change his mind about nuclear weapons." So I met with him in an hour and a quarter, ended up holding his hand, developing a kind of doctor-patient relationship with him. And he quoted to me from the Reader's Digest. I came out saying that from a clinical perspective, he had impending Alzheimer's, which he did. But I think that the whole movement, I mean, we got 1 million people in Central Park marching against nuclear war. It was profound. And 80% of people supported the notion of nuclear disarmament. And I think that movement helped bring Gorbachev and Reagan together in Reykjavik, where they almost agreed to abolish nuclear weapons, almost. But it brought the end to the Cold War. So really, the movement I created and brought in all of those doctors, et cetera, and talking on television. I was in Vogue magazine and everything, brought about, in a way, the end of the Cold War, because people got very scared about nuclear weapons and nuclear war. Then when the Cold War ended and they talked about a peace dividend, using the money that they'd spent on weapons to fund peace and education and healthcare, that was when the corporations, the Lockheed Martin, etc., moved to educate all the newly liberated countries like Latvia and Lithuania, etc. I think there were 17, when James Baker, Secretary of State, promised Gorbachev that NATO would not move in and take over those countries, newly liberated countries, all around the border of Russia. But there was a man called Norman Augustine, who was the head of Lockheed Martin, who went to those countries and said, hey, do you want to be a democracy? Yeah, they said. Well, do you want to join NATO? Yeah, they said. To join NATO, they had to buy millions of dollars worth of weapons. And he was the one that destroyed that agreement with Gorbachev and James Baker. And all those little countries have been weaponized with missiles pointing in towards Russia, which is one of the reasons that Putin went into the Ukraine, because he asked America to remove all the missiles on the border of Russia and not let the Ukraine join NATO, which is really America. And they refused. Now, Putin had already asked about 10 years before that if Russia could join NATO. And Bill Clinton said no, because you're too big, you can't join NATO. So really the ball was in Americans' court. And what they've done is foster a totally new nuclear arms race, spending most of America's money on building weapons, replacing every single nuclear missile, nuclear weapon, plane, ship, submarine. They're doing that, spending $1 trillion in the next 20 years to do that. So it's really obscene. So America, it's not the Department of Defense, it's the Department of Murder.
Obviously,
Right?
I agree. I agree with.
Not. They're making
Can you hear
weapons.
me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. In fact, I spent the last number of years trying to bring out and expose these very things that you've talked about.
I know. Yeah.
Between the United States and Russia. And it's always been their goal to break up, destroy Russia, get rid of Putin, and then steal their resources. This is America's foreign policy and always has been. In the film that I made, and thanks to you, who played the leading role, really, the opening of the film is very powerful. It was a clip of you speaking to an audience and talking about what would happen if there was a nuclear bomb that was exploded on Boston. And that's very frightening. And you said in that, we are walking like lemmings towards the cliff of nuclear annihilation. I've never forgotten that. And then there's another quote at the very end of the film, and I'm going to use that to segue into the next part of the show in an article you wrote. I have never forgotten this. You said, are we an evolutionary aberration designed in an evolutionary sense not to survive? And you said, I wonder. Helen, I am pretty discouraged that today people really are walking like lemmings to the cliff of nuclear annihilation. And I have to wonder, are we? Is there something in our DNA that is suicidal? And when you look at what we're facing today, this conflict in Ukraine, which is really a war of the United States against Russia.
Yes, of course.
And now just a month ago, October 7th, all hell breaks loose in Israel with Hamas, and it's still going on. Thousands and thousands of people in Gaza, Palestinians, have been killed. Goodness knows how many people in Israel Hamas has killed, and soldiers. Israel is an undeclared nuclear state.
They've got 250 hydrogen bombs. Why? Because if they use them, they'd blow themselves up. So why have they got them? It's a status symbol. It's a testosterone equivalent.
Okay, we're going to get to that. Do you believe we are closer now to a nuclear confrontation, either because somebody insane somewhere pushes the button, or some young military person in America misread, or even a young person in Russia misreads something on a radar screen, or my God, with so many United States F-16s, B-1 bombers, nuclear capable, flying right along Russia's border, the possibility of somebody mistaking it this time, is this for real? Do you think we are closer now to nuclear annihilation than ever before?
Yes, I do. I do. Yep. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist has its clock at, what is it, 90 seconds to midnight? It should be 5. And the other thing is that Putin has threatened to use nuclear weapons. And things are so fragile between the two, and there's virtually no communication. And yes, there are 2 men in each missile silos, each armed with a pistol, one to shoot the other if one shows signs of deviant behavior. What if the deviant one shot the other one and launched the missile? They take drugs down there. I mean, there are so many ways by accident or by design that we can blow ourselves up. And I must say, I wake up every morning and look at my garden and my roses and I think, we're still here. That's how I feel. Yeah.
Yeah. The danger of an accident, as you said, has increased exponentially. And I know friends that I have here in Russia, when I say, "Are you afraid of this?" And they say, "No, most of them will say, we really don't think anybody would be crazy enough to do that." But it is
But it could be an
disturbing.
accident.
Yeah. But it's very disturbing to me today that people are walking like lemmings towards the cliff of
Yeah.
nuclear annihilation.
Yeah, they
And,
are.
in 2016, when I started making that film, 30 Seconds to Midnight, and it was published early in 2017, I titled the film 30 Seconds to Midnight. At the time, the Bureau of Atomic Scientists had it 3.5 minutes to midnight, and gradually they've lowered it and lowered it and lowered it. And you said you would say 5 seconds to midnight. I have said many times in print and in my shows that if I were to release that film today in 2023 or 2024 coming up, I would have entitled it The Final Countdown. 5,
Yeah.
4.
Dr. Strangelove. Yep.
Yeah. So
Dr.
I
Strange.
want to segue now. I want to segue now to an article that you wrote and you sent to me. The title of it, as I mentioned, is the topic for the show: Why Men Kill and Why Women Let Them. Now, I'm going to quote from the first 2 short paragraphs of this article. And you wrote, "Whale watching in the lovely Jervis Bay on the east coast of Australia, the baby whales were leaping out of the water, turning somersaults in pure joy as they revealed their white bellies and black backs. I returned home and realized with horror that not only will this magnificent species be eliminated, but so too the spectacular sunflowers that had just opened their gorgeous heads in my garden." And you continued, "We stand on the brink of extinction, unaware that our time on this precious lump of rock in the endless universe is almost certainly to come to an end." Helen, why did you write this?
Well, I mean, I've been aware of this all my life since I read On the Beach by Neville Shute, the Australian author. And that book was about a nuclear war occurring in the Northern Hemisphere by accident. And the people in Melbourne were the last to die as the radiation moved to the Southern Hemisphere. And in the end, and I lived in Melbourne that time as an adolescent. In the end, everyone died. And so that left a mark upon my soul. And so I've always been aware of nuclear war. But of course, having written Nuclear Madness and Missile Envy, and I've written up to 13 books or contributed, I'm totally aware of everything that's happening in America and indeed around the world. So that's why I know we're closer than ever before, and we're in the hands of fallible human beings, mostly men. And so, and I've also, because I wrote that article, looked at women and why women are different from men. And then I think of the play Laser Strata, which is a Greek play, centuries ago, was written where the men kept killing and killing, right, like now. And the women said, okay, no more sex. Guess what? They stopped killing. So men need sex more than they need to kill. And there's a recent woman president in a country in Africa who did the same thing, and it worked. So then I thought, I'll look at the hormones. So there was an experiment done in a lab in San Francisco where the woman, the scientist, was looking at hormones in men and women. And she noticed that when there was a dispute in the lab and a fight, the men would go into their rooms, slam the door and fume. And the women would come in the next morning, clean the benches, make the coffee and make everything better. So she did their hormones. And what happened was that the men's testosterone went sky high and the women's oxytocin went up. Now, oxytocin is a wonderful hormone that's secreted when you're breastfeeding. And I know when I breastfed my babies, I felt I could feed the whole world. I used to have big dinner parties and then fall asleep in the soup because I was so tired. But it's a lovely hormone. And if you put aerosol oxytocin in men's nostrils, they become nurturing and loving. And as 52% of the world's population are women, I get so cross with looking at these organizations, which are all men. And I must say, wretches, they're all sitting with their ties, which kind of represent their penises. And there are no women. So why do women let men kill? Then they did some experiments with rats and found, and I can't exactly remember what it was, but if you put two male rats in a cage, they'll fight each other and their testosterone goes up. But if you put a female in, I think, oh, look, I can't remember the experiment. I'm sorry, but it mirrors what the woman in the lab found. And from that perspective, from a physiological perspective, it is very clear that women should run the world. Now, people will say, well, what about Thatcher? Yeah, well, some women who get to have power join the male ethos to get to the power. But most women are not like that. And there lies my thesis. And if I was younger and not 85, I'd love to be president or prime minister of this country. Or, I mean, it would be so easy.
A couple of points I want to mention. You mentioned earlier when you went to France and even in Australia that the politicians weren't listening to you. They weren't interested. I think we could say the same thing is true today in terms of the threat of nuclear power, the danger of radiation, and
but
all
you
of those.
See, what I'm able to do on television with the audience is treat them as a patient. And how many times have I had to tell patients they had a lethal disease and deal with their grief and their emotions and etc. So as a doctor, I establish a doctor-patient relationship with my audience. So I'm able to do that and break through their psychic numbing, which is what I'm trained to do.
Well, I have to take my hat off to you, and I'm so proud to know you and to help in what little way I can through what I do to try to continue to share your message and educate people about all of this. You mentioned women who do rise to power, and when you mentioned that, I immediately thought of Hillary Clinton, the head of I guess the European Union, van der Leyen, this defense minister from Germany, Bommerbach, I think is her name. And then I think of Victoria Nuland.
Oh, she's revolting. She did the
But
Maiden Square massacre in the Ukraine and started this whole thing off. She's
yeah,
a
I
revolting person.
yeah, with handing out cookies and
I
sandwiches.
know, I know,
Yeah.
I know, I
So
know.
here's the question. You said most women don't do that. What they did, try to rise to the ceiling, the top of the power pyramid. But do you have any idea what these women sacrifice, or do they not produce the same hormones that the majority of women do? I mean, how is it that women who are nurturing, supposedly, and I believe that they are, how is it that they abandon that? Is it just the
Well,
lust and quest
yeah, I
for
think it's
power?
lust for power. Yes, yes. But there are other women. Who was the president of Germany?
Uh, Merkel.
She was terrific. There have been women who've been absolutely wonderful. And there are some women presidents now in countries in Africa who are wonderful. So, if only I could have been president.
Yeah, yeah, right. I would vote. I would vote for you. Okay, so Helen, this is the thing that's in your article that I found very interesting. Um, and you gave several examples of men in war raping and taking advantage of women. Tell me a little bit about that and what the connection is with violence and sex.
There obviously is a connection between sex and war, and it's shown by that play La Strata where they said, okay, the women said, no more sex unless you stop fighting. And they stopped fighting. So it's very clear that men need sex more than they need to kill each other.
Well, you gave a couple of other examples, and I was aware of this. During World War II, the Japanese had
Comfort
maybe
women.
maybe a million
Yeah.
Korean comfort
Yeah.
women.
Korean women. It was dreadful.
And you talked about Boko Haram, where they took over a school with 270 some girls. Uh,
Yes.
and there are so many other instances all around American military bases offshore in other
Yep.
countries. The number of cases of rape, of domestic violence, are they're unprecedented.
Mm.
And so, do you think, Helen, that there's an answer? Is the answer that women have to wake up and say, okay, no more sex? If you go to war, you pick up a gun? Or do you think that basically, we are predetermined to self destruct?
I think women should take over the world. That's what I think. More and more women are getting elected. In Australia, there are more and more women politicians, many of them young. It's happening, but it's too slow. And in the military, of course, they're almost all men, and the women get raped in the military. Look, it's a big thing, Regis, and I don't really have a solution at this stage.
Well, I wish there were a solution. Um, but given the way most of the world is now weaponized, I don't care where you look. You
Yeah,
can look in Africa,
I
the
know.
wars and intertribal wars
Yeah,
and violence is unbelievable. And they're all armed. They're all so you see the pictures, they're all military, funded, of course, by the colonial masters. You look all across Europe, Latvia, Lithuania, uh, these countries are all heavily weaponized. You can look to Western Asia. Everybody is militarized. And so when I look at this situation around the world, we really have become uh, a large military installation
yeah,
uh, with the intent with the intent of not searching and seeking freedom, democracy, equality for all, with the intent of destroying itself. And this is what we started talking about in the beginning. We have the weapons now that humankind has never seen before. Weapons, as we have talked about, that have the ability, the capacity to eliminate life, all life on this planet. And so I'll segue to this. You know, Russia is not a utopia. During the Soviet Union, it became really powerful, the second largest superpower, by building up its nuclear capability. You mentioned Gorbachev when he met with Reagan. I have documented this in a couple of my videos and films. He offered Reagan, as you said, let's get rid of all nuclear weapons. And Reagan, unfortunately, could not do it.
Because he got stuck up on Star Wars, that's why.
Exactly right. The missile defense Star Wars system, which obviously doesn't work. But then when you look at Russia's posture in the world since Putin took over, he wanted to join the EU. He wanted to join NATO. He simply wanted security assurances, and he thought that was the way to do it. I believe in my heart, and I followed Putin very closely, and I've watched so many of his speeches. And yesterday he had another one of these 4-hour marathon sessions with journalists from around the world, just free fall, asking him questions. This man, in my opinion, is the only one on the planet who has been talking about peace, who has been talking about doing away with war, using the United Nations and the principles of the United Nations upon what it was founded to solve problems, not war. He is the biggest person promoting multipolarity, or the equality of all nations, the sovereignty of all nations, that we work together to help all nations develop. And closely associated with this is the BRICS movement with Russia, China, and India, now many, South Africa, and many nations now, and the countries in the Middle East now are joining. I think, and I wonder if you think, that this is the way out. This is the possibility that countries around the world are realizing that colonialism, totalitarianism, has not worked for anybody.
Yeah, but it won't stop America.
Okay, let's segue to that. Here we have this different paradigm of a multipolar world and the American paradigm of a unipolar world, as America being the hegemon. I have said so many times, and I wonder if you would agree, this is the epic battle, in the true sense of the word epic, for the future order and survival of the world. Helen, your thoughts now. I have an idea. You said America won't allow that. What might happen?
Well, I'll tell you what. Two things. Trump liked Putin. Trump started no wars. And it's a good idea to like Putin. It's a good idea to like Russia. It's a good idea to like China. We must make friends with everyone. So that's number one. Number two, everyone in America has guns. And with Trump, about to be elected and all his followers following him like a cult, there could be a civil war. I don't know. But it's interesting to think that Trump didn't start any wars. I don't think he likes war. He's bad in every other way. He's a fascist. But we're on the brink of annihilation. We're on the precipice of possibly fixing things. But I think with silly old Biden, who is being orchestrated by Virginia Newland and Robert Kagan, her husband, the neocons, we're in a terrible position. Look, I know that other countries won't have any influence on America because she does her own things and wants to be. I love it that world-based rules of order. Whose rules of order? America. And they're scared of China because she's getting really big. China is not at all warlike. Look, I don't know. It's why men kill. Why men kill. You know, you look all the way back to the Greek vases, and there are men on horses with spears and stuff. Men have always killed. So I don't know if there's any hope for us, Regis, except if there was a revolution and the women said, look, get out of the way, we're taking over. But that's not going to happen. I would lead it, be it Joan of Arc or Helen of Arc, but I'm 85.
I am hopeful because of this movement, and it's growing towards a new world order.
Yep.
But you mentioned Trump. Now, Trump in many ways is kind of embarrassing and frightening, but I have talked about this endlessly. Trump went to Helsinki to meet with Putin.
I know.
And they met for several hours. They came out and they had a press conference. I wish they had never had that press conference because that doomed Donald Trump. They came out and they both talked about how we've made great progress. We're going to continue working together at different levels of the government, national security, etc. And we will meet again. And both of them expressed hope. Now, Trump no sooner got on his plane to return to America than everybody in America turned on him. The media turned on him. John McCain turned on him. So many others in both parties accused him of treason. And what happened because of this? Trump did a 180. I think Trump got a message that, you know what? You're stepping out of bounds, and we don't want you to forget what happened to John Kennedy and what happened to Richard Nixon.
Oh, they shot John Kennedy. I mean, I watched Kennedy's 1963 speech to American University. He was like a Jesus Christ. That's why they killed him.
Yeah, he was too much of a threat. And I think Trump represented too much of a threat. So I really don't know where that's going to go. You mentioned also Civil War. I just saw a video clip. It's just been released. It's called Civil War. And it's coming out in movie theaters early next year, in April of next year. They've always done this with the movies. They've preconditioned us to know what is coming. I mean, The Matrix, I can go back, and there's so many movies where they were telling us things that, this is unbelievable. It's science fiction, but it actually come true. Now, I know from firsthand personal knowledge that there are people, former military in the United States, who have been accumulating weapons, stocking up on ammunition, fuel, water, food, and supplies
To survive a nuclear war.
No, to survive a civil war in America. There isn't any.
Yeah.
And so I really do think that America already is involved in a non-shooting civil war.
Yeah.
But I think depending on what happens to Trump, if he is allowed to run and somehow he defeats whoever he runs against, Biden I don't think is going to make it to the finish line, or Trump is assassinated, denying him the election, or an assassination is going to end all of this talk about a different world, a new way. The other thing, Helen, that is hopeful, it's part of this multipolar world that we see emerging, is that there are many nations, Russia now, China, India, Pakistan, other countries, South American countries, getting rid of the United States petrodollar. And
Yeah.
the more they
Well,
the
that's
more
why
they
they
do,
killed Gaddafi, because he was going to move from the United States dollar.
that's right. That's right. And so this de-dollarization, it was easy enough to kill Gaddafi, easy enough to kill Kennedy, who wanted to do basically the same thing. But you can't kill all of these countries now that are on their own, refusing to use the dollar in their trade with each other. And
Yeah.
I wonder if you think uh, that's that's the one hope that I have that can bring America down, um, without
If we have
really.
time,
Go ahead.
if we have time.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. We are at less than 5 seconds, maybe, to.
And I'll
Uh,
tell you something else that occurred to me the other day, just out of the blue. These men that built these nuclear weapons knew they could never be used. Knew they could never be used, and yet they've built thousands. They built 70,000 of them during the Cold War.
yeah, and I think there's only one word to really describe what we're talking about, and I think it's evil.
Of
Um,
course, it's evil.
it
Of course,
it
it's evil.
Yeah, and when you look at what's happening in the world today, um, I can only think of one word, that is evil forces are taking grasp of the entire planet, the human race, and with the sole goal is to destroy what's left of us, what's left of the goodness of humankind. Uh, I think, Helen, and we'll conclude with this, your last thoughts. I like the use of the word the epic battle, but might this not be just the latest version of the epic battle between good and evil,
I
fallen
agree with
angels
you. Yeah,
and good angels?
I agree with you, Regis. And you're a priest, and you understand that. And for that, I honor you.
Well, thank you. I used to be an active priest,
Yeah.
but theologically trained in scripture, and I'm not religious by any means now. I believe in a creator spirit. I believe in a universal force for good. But I really do think that what we're seeing now, it's hard to deny that it is not a fight between good and evil.
Oh, you're
Epic.
absolutely right. Absolutely right, Regis.
We've been looking at this situation a little bit differently, and I hope that more and more people would continue to go down this path. Why men kill and why women let them. I
Yeah.
think this is a very, very important message for women, for
Yeah.
women to
Mm.
recognize their uniqueness, their
Yeah.
inherent really
And
power.
their power. And their power.
And that also is another reason for hope, that if more and more women could understand this, uh, we still might get out of this mess. Helen, thank you so much. We'll get back to you. We'll stay in touch as we always have. I can't thank you enough for all you have done for me to open my eyes about the real dangers that we face. Helen, take care.
My intense pleasure, Regis.
My hope in all of this is the prophecies of my elders, which tell us that there will be a global awakening. People from all corners of the world will rise up and will unite in order to heal the earth, in order to come back together as community, as kin, that we will start recognizing ourselves within one another. We will see the eyes of our children in the eyes of other people's children. We will see our future in the guaranteed future of others. We will see our ability to continue to exist here in this beautiful place, tied to our connection to the earth and our responsibility for preserving and protecting the earth. And that is happening around the world right now. I travel all over and I've met with people from all walks of life, from different corners of the world, and this awakening is happening. So the prophecies that the elders have been telling us about for generations are coming to fruition. Right now, things seem chaotic, they seem destructive, it seems like we're descending into darkness. But what I believe is that we are really in a birthing process. We are now in the long, dark birth canal, and there's new life emerging. And we are part of that birthing process. We're either locked into the deep, dark birth canal, terrified by the darkness, or we're standing beside the mother, assisting the birth. And I think that it's critical for all of us to recognize that right now, all of the things that we're seeing come into the light are opportunities for us to heal. The things that are happening now in the world aren't new. They're on a larger scale, perhaps, and they're being illuminated because the sun is at high noon. And what this does is it brings everything that's been in the shadows into the light. And that's a really remarkable time. That gives us this really incredible opportunity to come together as a species for the first time, perhaps, in human history.
The only real hope lies in the result of the epic battle for humanity's survival between two competing and contrasting worldviews. On one side is America's unipolar, forced march for world capitalist domination with the use of the greatest military the world has ever known. On the other side is a view held by Russia, China, and the BRICS nations that is building a multipolar world based on respect, the sovereignty of all nations, international law, the equal value of all peoples, and cooperation. Russia and China consider themselves as strong enough in their combined military and economic strength to withstand any acts of aggression. They will not accept the dictatorship of a unipolar world. So, here we are, humanity's epic battle for survival. An old geopolitical paradigm based on white colonial domination and empire versus the shared vision of others who are working for a peaceful world based on justice, international law, peace, and the respect, value, and prosperity of all people. The only question that matters is, will the neocons in Washington and their global elite masters, knowing they have lost this epic struggle, take the whole world down with them in a nuclear Armageddon? As Dr. Helen Caldicott said in the opening, this scenario is the only thing that matters now for all of humanity and all life on the planet.
Are we an evolutionary aberrant, designed in an evolutionary sense not to survive? I wonder.